Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Senate's report on the CIA's extensive use of torture gives new meaning to the term shock and awe. Obama's words, "we tortured some folks," is a gross understatement. Will anyone ever be punished for these crimes? To CrossTalk, the report on CIA torture, I'm joined by my guest, Ray McGovern in Washington. He is a former CIA analyst. Also in Washington, we have Fred Fleitz. He is a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy and also a former CIA analyst. And in Lima, we cross to Amy Goodman. She is the host and executive producer of the news program Democracy Now! All right, CrossTalk rules, and in fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. I'd like to go to Amy in Lima first. Not long ago, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, said, okay, we tortured some folks. Now we have the report, or at least part of the report, a truncated version of it. What's your reaction when you think about what President Barack Obama said about the CIA and torture?
I mean, we're talking about a horrific roster of tortured both strategies, approaches, and also the number of people who are held in black sites around the world. Whether we're talking about abuse by hypothermia, killing at least one prisoner in Afghanistan simply because he was left in the cold and the dark for so long, or the horror of rectal feeding. There was no medical reason for this. It was simply torture, pureeing his full meal, forcing him forward, and injecting it into him. This is not acceptable in a civilized society.
All right.
Under any civilized standards. And the question now is, who will be held accountable?
Okay, Fred, if I can go to you in Washington, the Justice Department has already made it clear that it will not be opening any criminal investigations whatsoever. So how do you square the two? What we just heard from Amy here, looking at the report, I mean, shock and awe. I mean, how can you not be shocked by what you can read in that report? And that is a truncated version.
It's nice to be on your show. I think what I just heard from Amy is just complete nonsense. These programs were carefully vetted by the Justice Department. They did not amount to torture. They were fully briefed to Congress, and I know there's members of Congress and the Democratic Party who are trying to claim otherwise. That's just not true. The real issue here is that this report, frankly, is not serious. It is a Democratic piece of propaganda. It was completely written by the Democratic staff. But the worst thing of all is that this report accuses CIA officers of very serious crimes, and they were not given a chance to defend themselves. In this country, you have a chance to face your accuser and defend yourself. Even former CIA directors were not given this opportunity to defend themselves. This report is, frankly, a piece of junk.
Okay, Ray, a piece of junk. You're a former CIA analyst, as Fred is. What's your reaction to the report?
Well, Peter, I tend to be fact-based. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. Fred actually has openly admitted that he thinks policymakers should be making intelligence analysis judgments, so I'm not surprised to hear him dismiss the report. My view is that these staffers working under Senator Feinstein have done an incredible service to our country. And I just hope that we learn from this and that people will be held accountable because we know who they are named in the report, and I don't see how a president can simply say, well, we're only going to look forward now when these horrific crimes, such as Amy alluded to, have been exposed. One wonders what's in the 6,000 pages that were denied to Congress, or what's in the redactions. If there's worse stuff, my goodness, we need to have it all hanging out, and we need to hold people accountable.
Okay, I'd like to go back to Amy. What I was trying to get at here is that, you know, if the Justice Department says it's not going to pursue any criminal investigation of this, then what is the value of the report? What do we learn from it?
Oh, this is very important. Ultimately, it's not even just up to the Justice Department of either a Democratic or a Republican administration. As we see what's happening in the streets all over the United States, the protests calling for special prosecutors in the case of police brutality, ultimately, it's up to the people of our country, what they feel should represent our country to the rest of the world. I mean, to say we must put this all behind us, what does this say to any murderer in the United States? If they come to court and say, oh, I'm even admitting that I did this, they hand in a report, I did murder this person, but that was yesterday. Let's all look ahead. No, that's not acceptable. How do you enforce law and order? How do you ensure that your own citizens are not tortured in other places in the world when we do not deal with those who are involved with torture in a simple law and order way? I mean, the issue of waterboarding, which is absolutely illegal, that you had some prisoners waterboarded over, well, close to 200 times. The fact that those who were tortured, for example, one of the closest aides to Osama bin Laden, revealed information freely when he was first taken. But then, when he was tortured, he began to lie, and he clammed up. I mean, what is most stunning in this report, aside from the revelations of all the strategies used to inflict pain, is that no actionable intelligence came from any of this. It is a lesson to any of those who believe, well, you got to do something bad if it's a bad person involved. No, if that person who has a ticking time bomb somewhere, if that person is tortured and they lie to end the pain, that helps no one.
Fred, the CIA director, current CIA director, Rennan, says that the CIA, using these type of this program, saved lives, but he gives no evidence of it whatsoever. In the report, there is no evidence either that any of the things that they were doing were actionable in a positive sense to further national security. So, you know, again, you know, a whole policy approach that is just a failure.
Well, it did save lives, and several CIA directors wrote a very prominent editorial in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that said this. Former CIA Deputy Director John McLaughlin explained how this saved lives. But my question is, if these former CIA officials are so sure that this program saved lives, and I know it saved lives because I was on the House Intelligence Committee staff, I saw examples where this program saved lives. But why didn't the authors of this report talk to CIA officials who said it saved lives? The reason? Because this is a piece of propaganda, and they did not want their pre-cooked report to be spoiled by inconvenient facts.
Okay, Ray, but, you know, it is the United States signed the 1949 Convention, Geneva Convention Against Torture. This is why they don't want to admit anything, because then they would be held culpable for the crimes that they have committed. So what they do is just go into complete denial. It never happened.
Well, Peter, let's be clear about the what comes first. Torture is not wrong because there's a UN convention against it or because there are U.S. statutes against it. There are U.S. statutes against it and the UN convention because torture is flat out wrong. It's always been morally wrong. You cannot authorize torture any more than you can authorize slavery or rape, let's say. They inhabit the same moral category. Now, John Kimmons, head of Army Intelligence, on the same day that George Bush came forth and said that enhanced interrogation techniques were very, very useful, he stood up 3 hours before and said this, and I quote, "No good information has ever come from abusive practices. History shows that, and the empirical evidence of the last 5 years, comma, hard years, comma, also shows that." That was the same day that George Bush came up with his enhanced interrogation technique. Now, what I want to add here is that it is true, it's universally recognized, I think Fred would even agree, that you can't get good information from torture, but you can get bad information. Works like a charm. If you want to get Alibi, the prisoner, if you want to get him to confess to having sent operatives up to be trained by Saddam Hussein in weapons of mass destruction. You can do that. They did that. George Bush bragged about that 3 days before the vote in Congress. And indeed, Colin Powell was deceived by the same spurious intelligence. So if you want to torture people for unreliable information, and that's precisely what they did, works like a charm, Peter, works like a charm.
Well, Fred, you know, there is conclusive evidence there were many people in the chain of command, like Colin Powell, that were not told about this because, quote unquote, he would blow his stack because he would be adamantly against these kind of programs because, just as Ray has just said, they don't amount to much. You don't get any positive, actionable intelligence to further national security.
But that's not true. Numerous CIA officials said it did provide actionable intelligence. It helped us find Osama bin Laden. It helped us find Shalik K. Mohammed. It helped us stop the second wave attacks of al-Qaeda attacks against the West Coast. It provided a huge amount of information that was crucial to stopping terrorist attacks against this country, and it was carried out at a time when we were scared to death there would be more attacks. The biggest problem with this report is that there's no context. It doesn't reflect the fact that we were in a Pearl Harbor type situation where the CIA was asked to do whatever was possible to stop more terrorist attacks against this country. I don't deny that there were some mistakes made and maybe some things that shouldn't have happened to this program.
All right, we're going to we'll go back to quote-unquote mistakes after our short break. After our short break, we'll continue our discussion on the recent Senate torture report. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Senate report on CIA torture. Okay, I'd like to go back to Amy in Lima. I think one of the most tragic things about this report, and I agree with Ray that I'd like to know what else is in there, considering some of the finer details, if I can use that word, that we know of. You know, Amy, I've lived abroad a good part of my life in trying to explain to people why Americans feel like they can do anything they want in the world with impunity while condemning some of the same practices that the U.S. government has been deceived about by one of its own agencies, the CIA.
Well, I mean, this is a very good point. And when Fred was talking about the concern of people in the United States after 9/11, that is absolutely justified, that people were afraid. But when the U.S. engages in these unlawful practices, like torture, that actually decreases our national security. It threatens us because it means that there is a license. We're sending a message that it's okay to do this, and then it's okay to do this to U.S. citizens. And I think it's very important to point out, for all the horrific details in this just executive summary, it's not even the thousands of pages that should be actually all declassified. This is only the tip of the iceberg, because this only looks at CIA torture techniques. It doesn't even look at the CIA when it came, for example, to extraordinary rendition, which is White House jargon for kidnapping. I mean, it doesn't look at the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, for example, Donald Rumsfeld, and what they were doing, or the State Department. So this is looking at one strand. And ultimately, I think what has to happen now is that the United States has to show that those who engage in unlawful activity are prosecuted, and if found guilty, punished. And that would include President Bush, again, put on trial. If there isn't the evidence, as Fred contends, he could be acquitted. But we're talking President Bush, we're talking Vice President Cheney, we're talking Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, we're talking about the White House counsel, Alberto Gonzales, we're talking about the lawyers that wrote the memos that justify the torture, like John Yoo and others. We have to hold those in power accountable in the same way that if someone was involved in a murder, they have to be held accountable. The person who gave them the gun has to be held accountable. We in the United States call that felony murder if you were accomplice to murder. We have to have a uniform standard of justice. That's what will make us safer.
Okay, Fred, would you like to reply to that? What Amy just said?
Well, in Amy's unicorn rainbow world, we would shut down the CIA because there's no nasty people in the world. We don't have to have tough intelligence programs. Let's keep in mind, a special prosecutor was already named by the Obama administration. It did not prosecute, did not indict anyone. End of story, Amy. Your guy, President Obama, already investigated this. There were no prosecutions. There were no indictments. This was done according to the law, according to complete notification to the U.S. Congress. It was not torture.
Okay, I want Amy to be able to reply to that.
Please let me respond to what you said, Fred. I want to yes, I want to be able to respond to this. First of all, President Obama is not my guy. I am a journalist who covers this issue. And I am a journalist who covers President Obama in the same way that I cover President Bush. When it comes to the issue of those who are responsible not being indicted or prosecuted, I agree with you. That is wrong. Let's look at who has been held accountable in this case. None of the people involved in the torture, and I don't use the word torture lightly. We're talking about waterboarding, people almost suffocating. We are talking about people held in such cold conditions that the CIA agents themselves talked about the dungeon that they were held in. We're talking about prisoners dying of hypothermia because they're placed in the cold, forced feeding, rectal feeding for no medical reason except to torture them, and so much more. But the only person who's been held accountable is John Kiriakou, who worked, intelligence guy himself, who blew the whistle and ends up in jail for years. Now, that is not acceptable in a democratic society, that the whistleblower goes to jail and those who are engaged in torture go free.
Okay, Ray, let me go to you. The CIA and its protectors in Washington are just furious that this report has been released. They fought long and hard, months and years, to make sure this report wouldn't be released. It's not because of the content, it's that they don't want to be held accountable.
Well, it's worse than that, Peter. It is the fact that George Tenet, who was the impresario of these torture techniques, and Porter Goss, his successor, and Michael Hayden, who actually lied about that, and it's very clear in the report, were given an opportunity to help John Brennan redact the report. Can you imagine? These are people who are actually running the torture program. Now, when George Tenet wrote his book, okay, he wrote this book, At the Center of the Storm, 2007. He included a very interesting paragraph. He said, we were given authorities such as the CIA had very seldom had in the past, and I was afraid that people, including me, would be brought up to explain how we use these authorities because they were rather far-reaching. Well, hello, it's finally come to that. George Tenet said famously 5 straight times on 60 Minutes, we don't torture people, we don't torture people, we don't torture, listen to me now, we don't torture people, we don't torture people. Well, we know now that they have tortured people. The prospect of George Tenet hiding up there in some law firm or some security establishment in New York and having this Teflon coating because Obama is afraid of the CIA, that's a strange pass that our democracy has come to.
Mm-hmm. Fred, there's been alerts put around the world for the U.S. diplomatic and military installations worried about blowback, reaction to this report here. But that's what it really gets down to, isn't it? It's always about blowback. So you have to be more crueler than the people you're fighting, to terrorize them so much that they will not react. But that never works. Never in history has that ever worked. But it looks like that's what the U.S. Agencies like the CIA believe in the 21st century.
I don't know what you're talking about. ISIS is chopping off heads. These enhanced interrogation methods were not torture. They did not inflict long-lasting damage on the people who were subjected to them. I mean, there's simply no contrast here. I am concerned that revealing the information in this report is going to cause terrorist attacks and threats to American citizens abroad. It was completely unnecessary. We went through this in 2009 when President Obama released the details on all of these techniques.
Okay, Amy, if I can go back to you in Lima. And I say this very seriously, and I'm not being facetious, but around the world, many people think that the Americans treat torture as a value in itself.
I mean, this is a very serious issue. When you have someone like Fred, who worked for the CIA, saying, look, ISIS is beheading people, and we have to do something about this, we have to look at what motivates people to be recruited to terrorist organizations like the Islamic State. And what angers and infuriates populations is when they are unjustly terrorized. And that's what's happening in this case. You know, Dianne Feinstein was not an ally of all of those human rights groups for a very long time that wanted this information out there. It was civil society hearing from people who were wrongly detained, the lies that were told. I mean, you have a situation that is written about in this report where a U.S. ambassador is demanding to a country open up its prisons to the International Committee of the Red Cross so that the prisoners would be able to be seen. And at the same time, in those prisons were these ghost detainees, were prisoners being held by the CIA, who the U.S. was not allowing to be known about or to be seen. This kind of hypocrisy eats away at our national security. We have to be just. This is not just some utopian vision of the world. We have to be better than that, and that's what will make us safer.
Ray, do you think anything will be learned from this report? Because I'm awfully pessimistic.
Well, just to pick up from what Amy just said, you know, at the worst of the jihadists that were coming into Iraq during the 2005, 6, 7, there was an Air Force major, Matt Alexander is his pseudonym, and he was running the interrogation of these people who were captured. And he pointed out that 90% of them, when they were asked why they came in from Libya or Morocco or Tunisia, 90% of them said, because we saw the photos from Abu Ghraib and we know about CIA's enhanced interrogation technique. So if the objective is to create longer lines still for the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or whatever terrorist group, nothing does that better than torture.
Okay, Fred, would you like to react to that?
I completely reject that idea. There are some people on the left who think that the American presence in the Middle East, the enhanced interrogation program, the war in Iraq is why radical Islam and radical Islamist terrorists exist. That's simply wrong. This is a war against Western society. It's a war against the United States and its values. It's a war against Europe. If we pulled out of the Middle East, and if Israel pulled out, which some wackos on the left would like, there would still be radical Islamists. They would still be conducting terrorism. We're not going to have more terrorists because of the enhanced interrogation program.
All right, let me go to Amy. I want to give Amy the last word on the program. Last word on the program. Amy, I would just suggest that a lot of people in the world, particularly the Arab world, would love to have some Western values, but the Americans support tyranny and monarchs in the Gulf.
I think what's important is to know there's a distinction between the U.S. government and the American people. And when the American people have the information that's released in this report, and hopefully all of it will be released, I think they will put pressure on their government to reflect a very different America, an America that doesn't torture, that stands up for law and order in the world.
All right, folks, thank you very much for a very spirited debate on a very important topic. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in Lima, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.